Sorry about that. I've been yapping for the last minute and didn't see that the microphone was not on. My apologies. Welcome back to another thrilling episode of Fraggoth Reads. I'm Fraggoth, and today we're going to be reading the start of Regenesis by CJ Cherryh. It is a direct sequel, as I have indicated. This does not include maps. I wonder why. This is a direct sequel to Cyteen. And I believe it picks up more or less right after. Let's see. One sec. This actually has an exact date. I don't know why my microphone's acting up lately, today. So she releases the original Cyteen back in 1988. She works on and off on a sequel for 20 years. And releases Regenesis in 2009. Okay, so I'm looking for a date. What is the last date I see in the OG Cyteen here? Let me find any computer log entries. Is usually good enough, or the start of a chapter, and that's also pretty good. Dum-de-day. Flipping through pages on a fat book is not as easy as I make it look. Look. Oh wait, you can't see me. So there are that I can find no other cover art for Regenesis for some reason. I could have sworn there was some, like, for a European release that was different, but I cannot find it. I also sort of scrambled, so it might be out there, and I couldn't find it. I'll look again later. So I had totally forgotten to look for cover art. Oh my gosh, find me a computer interface screen here in this book. Good lordy. Okay, here we go. So the last transcript entry, which happens a bit before the events, the final climactic events of the book, Cyteen, come out. So it says 2424, which is the year, 2/3, which is either February 3rd or March 2nd, depending on how we do our dates. The dating schema changes drastically when we hit Regenesis. It turns into very American, wholly non-obtuse. It says literally March 27, 2424, as in the word March. So this is, call it a month, maybe 2 months later at most. Anyway, with that, I guess we might as well get started. I will warn people that I don't remember much of anything about this book, which doesn't necessarily speak well to it. I remember being somewhat bemused when I got through it the first time, and was like, well, that was nice, but, like, it didn't feel like it advanced the plot, is what I remember. But it's also been quite some time since I've read through it last. 5 years at least, probably closer to 10. It's been a hot minute, is what I'm saying. I guess the way it's sort of, the way I remember feeling was that Regenesis is like the interquel to like a really, really killer conclusion. We still have a bunch of the like sociology and politicking that goes on. That's kind of like what this book is all, what Cyteen is all about. Is here, let's have a human culture that's very different from one we recognize. What's different about it? What's going on here? You know, where they've got something that looks a whole hell of a lot like slavery going on. How's that work? Alrighty, there we go. I am struggling to find a good ending point. We may just make it a short one today. We'll see. I've got a backup spot if we get that done in, like, record time. So, yeah. 20 years for a sequel. Admittedly, she's, like, been writing books in and betwixt the entire time. So it's not like, say, George R.R. Martin, who has literally nothing else going on. Maybe I shouldn't bag on that guy as much as I do, but I definitely can and will. Perhaps that makes me a bad person. Sorry. Anyway, that I think is the ado necessary to get us into Regenesis and stuff. I'm going to see if I can find clean cover art that doesn't say, the long-awaited sequel to the Hugo Award-winning novel Cyteen and Down Below Station. Calling it a sequel to Down Below Station seems a tad disingenuous. But, you know, whatever. I can think of a bunch of books that are kind of better named as sequels to Down Below Station. Namely, what is it called? Finity's End? Or is it Tri-Point? I think it's Finity's End. Tri-Point is the one that's like a Shakespearean non-romance. Yeah, I think it's Finity's End. Feels more like a sequel to Down Below Station. Anyway, let's get rocking and rolling here. Let me slurp down some more water and we'll get moving. For the record, the photo here that's got a copy that's signed by CJ Cherryh is not mine. I do not have a signed copy of almost anything. I have one or two books that are signed by authors, but they're not... not the norm. They're ones that I got from, like, a library book sale. Or similar. Anyway, let's get rolling. Regenesis by CJ Cherryh. Copyright 2009. To Betsy's Determination. History of Union. The Post-War Period. Novgorod Publications. 2424. Union came out of the Company Wars with both territory and political integrity, not beholden to Earth or alliance for either. The Treaty of Pell, which ended active hostilities between Union and Alliance, left Earth independent, though militarily reliant on Pell's star. The Company fleet had defied Earth's authority, rejected the Treaty of Pell, and continued acts of piracy, as apt to prey on Earth's ships as on Union's, and now lacking a safe port. The treaty incidentally left the merchanter Council of Captains with more power than Pell's star station held in the affairs of the Alliance. And the same treaty ceded the greater expanse of human explored space to the authority of Union, but placed merchant trade exclusively in the hands of the Alliance Council of Captains. It was an agreement equally unpopular on all sides, which spoke a great deal to its fairness, and it was immediately followed by a period in which all former combatants maneuvered for advantage, everyone dreading a resumption of hostilities, but most convinced that war would break out again, probably within a lifetime. The Hinder stars, that bridge of closely lying, generally barren stars between Earth and Pell, became a zone of renewed interest for the Alliance, which governed that region. The Council of Captains, whose livelihood was their ships and their trade, looked to revitalize the mothballed stations on that route, stations that had collapsed economically with the advent of faster-than-light engines. Alliance thus moved to set itself as middleman between Earth and Union, and to profit from that trade. If it could re-establish viable populations to consume the goods it wanted to trade along the way. Union enjoyed the manufacture, mining, and prosperity of its own widely scattered stations, from Mariner and Viking to outlying Fargon, and it had the colonized world of Cyteen, with its major exports, the Rejuve drug, embryos, genetically enhanced biologicals, ASI workers, and concentrated foodstuffs. In the viewpoint of the merchanter captains of the Alliance, that was a somewhat reasonable model for what the Alliance could create around Pell's world, down below, by repopulating the abandoned star stations of the Hinder stars, and revivifying trade with not one, but two living worlds within their reach, down below and Earth itself. It was a reasonable model in all save one respect. The Alliance plan for the Hinder stars relied on recruitment of station citizens and the natural human birth rate to provide population. This meant luring the poorer of the residents of Pell and Earth to live in frontier conditions at outmoded pre-FTL stations. The natural human birth rate is slow. That was one flaw in the plan. And, the second, the poorer residents of Pell Station, who had suffered most in the war years, were not generally optimists about government promises. Spacers would never give up their ships and family connections to settle permanently on stations. Earth residents were barred by laws restricting emigration of its educated and essential. So a consumer population, particularly of educated and prosperous classes, was very hard to obtain in the Hinder stars. Subsidies began to drain Pell's economy and raise taxes on Pell Station itself, a source of great discontent. There was also a basic conflict between station interests and spacer interests. Stationers were not anxious to see their power further diminished by spacer exploitation of the planet beneath their feet. On the one hand, there was no great enthusiasm among stationers to visit their sole Earth-like planet. It had its hazards, and intelligent inhabitants. And secondly, there had begun to be a strong Green Party. That party, combined with those stationers fearing the Council of Captains would dominate the station itself, passed legislation making Pell's world a protectorate unavailable for colonization.
That cut one leg from under the merchanter captain's plan. Contrast this situation with Union, which exited the company wars with an abundance of thriving stations, 2 stations at Cyteen's own home star, besides Mariner and Viking, which posed a convenient bridge to the Alliance trade. The terms of the Treaty of Pell demanded Alliance merchanters serve those routes, as a condition of Union not building merchanters of their own. And this, of course, provided sorely needed markets for Alliance, but not as profitable markets, counting Union tariffs, as they would be if Alliance owned the cargoes and the stations. And, while Alliance merchanter ships plied Union space, serving chains of Union star stations down various strands of stars, it was universally Union industry which benefited from the transport. From Paris on one route to Fargon on the other, with Cyteen itself at the center, Union had come out of the company wars with the kind of trade network and consumer base that the Alliance only dreamed of building. Union stations numbered populations in the multiple hundreds of thousands, though Union was far younger than Pell. Cyteen itself, which did allow humans on-world, counted population in the millions, but the largest population center in Alliance space numbered, officially, counting both the remote and near stations at Pell, around 500,000. Counting the merchanters on ships and miners at various outposts, the whole population of the Alliance numbered probably 250,000 more. So the bulk of human population in the universe might still be What? Oh gosh, what happened here? Counting the merchanters on ships and miners at various outposts, the whole population of the Alliance numbered probably 250,000 more. So the bulk of human population in the universe might still be centered at Sol, with its billions, but the population of Union now had to be counted as a major alternate center. The exponential increase challenged the economic power that Alliance had once considered unassailable. If that rate of growth continued, one day there would be more humans in Union than presently lived on Earth itself. Union did not rely on natural human birth rate or on emigration. Union used birth labs. Union could create a station and, within 20 years, raise up thousands of highly motivated, trained inhabitants. Inhabitants ready to meet the difficulties of station building, perfectly content with barracks conditions at the outset, and ready to teach their naturally born children their values of hard work, adequate leisure, participation in the group, and, in due proportion, independent analytical thinking. More, Union had Rejuve, a product of Cyteen's biology, which doubled and tripled the productive years of its workers and thinkers. Natural reproduction might stop at 40 when a person went on Rejuve, but work and economic production went on, and the birth labs could enable individuals to reproduce into their next century. Alliance efforts to revive the Hinder stars, even starting with pre-built residencies and mothballed businesses, were slow and subject to supply and personnel shortages. They failed to meet immigrant expectations of quick riches and reasonable living conditions. Only the smallest, marginal traders were willing to ply those routes, while the richer Alliance ships engaged in the far more lucrative trade within Union space. Factor in the occasional appearance of Maziani pirates, former Earth Company fleet, at these lonely, largely undefended stations of the Hinder stars, and the reluctance of Alliance stationers to undertake the risk of living there was understandable. Union, seeing that the Maziani were deriving supply and new personnel from those stations, offered to assist the Alliance in patrols there, but old suspicions died hard. Alliance rebuffed Union offers, convinced that Union was seeking to control all these stations, which represented their route to Earth. Besides, the Alliance was engaged in another, secret project. It had long known of an Earth-class world within its grasp, and it mounted an expedition which the Alliance captains saw as finally giving the Alliance the exploitable world they so greatly wanted. The expedition arrived at that planet and found it already occupied by a human colony. A Union colony. The timing of the revelation could not have been worse for Alliance-Union relations. During the negotiations for the treaty, Pell had strongly insisted on acquiring adjacent territory, knowing that the world was there. But a secret Union operation at the close of the war had landed not a military occupation, but a colony. The CIT supervisors of the colony, largely military, had perished early. The ASI workers, however, had survived, multiplied, and scattered into the outback, incidentally commingling Terran origin biologicals and highly engineered microbes with the native fauna, and ultimately making accommodation with the native life. The revelation of the Union colony on that world, which came to be known as Gehenna, came close to shipwrecking the Treaty of Pell. Alliance held that the Union signers of the treaty had kept Gehenna a secret, and that the treaty had thus not been negotiated in good faith. Union responded that its negotiators had not known about the colony, and that, within the framework of Union government, all knowledge of the settlement had been sequestered within two of the branches of government, science and defense. Thus, the Bureau of State, which had negotiated and maintained the treaty, had had absolutely no knowledge there was a problem. Further, Union argued, the administrations of Science and Defense, under Emery of Science and Admiral Azov of Defense, had Let us try this again. Further, Union argued the administrations of Science and Defense, under Emery of Science and Admiral Azov of Defense, had profoundly changed personnel since the war, and with the present Council of Nine pressing strongly for peace, it made no sense, even to the most hawkish of the Alliance political parties, to lead humanity back to a state of war. Union formally apologized for the situation and offered amends. The situation was so volatile that Union accepted the Treaty of Gehenna, presented by Pell, virtually without amendment, to wit, that there would be no future manned landing on a biologically complex world except by joint participation of Alliance and Union on the mission, and there would be no landing on a world with a native intelligence until that intelligence could meet humans in space and speak for itself. By the same treaty, Union offered access to certain restricted technology in a joint Alliance-Union mission to be settled in orbit about Gehenna, a watchdog mission designed to preclude any biohazard getting off the planet. Regulations for any persons in contact with Gehenna became the standard for any future exploratory missions. Though the Treaty of Gehenna was accepted by both sides, the matter of Union assistance at the Hinder Stars was quietly tabled, quote, pending future study, unquote, and, as the third component of the treaty, certain trade concessions and tariff reductions were given to the Alliance Council of Captains as a confidence-building measure. Scholars tend to mark the Treaty of Pell as the beginning of the post-war cooling-off period, and the Treaty of Gehenna as its close, as if the era could be summed up within those parentheses. But between those two events, the death of a single human woman, Ariane Emery, and her rebirth in a parental replicate could ultimately prove of greater import in human history. As the rumor reached Pell and Earth that the architect of Union, and of Gehenna, had died, there had been reaction clear to the ends of human space. The war years, in which stations and whole planets had become logical targets, had threatened the existence of humankind, from the mother world to the most remote colony of Union space. That state of affairs had remained true for much of the first Ariane Emery's tenure in various offices. She had been a genius in genetics and psychology, served as director of Regenesis for a number of years, was the principal theorist behind Union's strong population push during the war, and she had served as Counselor of Science during a critical period of the post-war era, including the Gehenna operation. Her political views were pro-expansionist. She had been instrumental in the push of human populace and commerce to the farthest reaches of explored space. She had founded the genetic arcs, in which genetic records of every available Earth species were preserved. She had steered the development of the planet of Cyteen from a largely vacant wilderness to a continent-spanning network of towns and research centers, and the establishment of ecological studies on the second continent. She had begun her career in full accord with Union's early intentions to terraform the world of Cyteen into a new Earth, but her opinion had evolved over time into a determination to preserve its native fauna. The centrist party of her day, which had crystallized around Emery's change of opinion about terraforming, continued to press for terraforming Cyteen and basing Union around a strong central authority. Emery and the expansionists contrarily argued against further alterations to Cyteen and in favor of further colonization, with a strong emphasis on local autonomy of governments thus formed, a de facto decentralization of power. And Emery prevailed. Then, as a war-weary universe foresaw Emery's life winding down to a natural close, and as powers jockeyed to position themselves for a quieter post-Emery era of consolidation, Emery advanced a process called psychogenesis, the cloning of a psychologically and intellectually identical offspring. It was a procedure that had conspicuously failed before. When Emery was assassinated, many in Alliance and even in Union assumed that her final project had been aborted, incomplete, or that if ever attempted, it would fail. That, in effect, it had been the last forlorn hope of a dying woman. Within 2 years, a child named Ari Emery was born at Cyteen. I should also note here, and I meant to mention this at the top, I have been mispronouncing Bok, B-O-K, the entire time. Kept saying Boke or Burke. It's Bok. It will pop up once or twice in here. Not terribly often, but it is there. Book 1. Book 1. Section 1. Chapter 1. March 27, 2424. 1328 hours. Hundreds of babies floated in their vats, in various stages, in Rezun's largest birth lab. Azzy babies, CIT babies, much the same. Azzy were in one section. CIT babies, for citizen mothers who, for physical reasons, job reasons, or personal preference, didn't want to handle pregnancy the old-fashioned way, occupied another section of the same lab. The only difference between the two groups at this stage was a doorway, and whether a number or a CIT name tagged the vat. The data of real pregnancies bathed all the fetuses in a perpetual sea of appropriate chemistry and sound. The machinery of artificial wombs rocked them, moved them, kept them close and safe and warm. There was, on one side of that doorway, Aban AB-688, an Azzy. It would take a close look to see him floating in his tank. At 6 weeks, Aban AB was about pea-sized, though growing fast. He'd be tall someday. He'd be dark-haired and very, very clever, and cold as ice. In the tank beside him was Seely AS9, who had been conceived in the same hour. He would be of a slighter build, pale blonde, eyes fair blue, and, like Aban, he would be an alpha, and very, very smart. The 9 should have meant he was the 9th of his exact gene set and psych set combination. In fact, he was the 10th. The ordinary naming conventions did fall by the wayside at times, especially among highly socialized alphas, whose supervisors named them whatever they liked, or among very old foundational sets, whose numbers and alphabetics didn't always conform to modern usage. Aban, for instance, his personal alphabetic was B, but he had been given a name starting with both his letters. Someone's whimsy, perhaps. That was the first thing that was odd about Aban AB. Another was that, just like Sealy AS, this Aban reused a sequence number, 688. And that, all other conventions aside, should never happen. On the other side of that doorway, Jordan Nye, conceived within minutes of the others, would be born a CIT, citizen class, for no other reason than he had a CIT number and came with no manual, no set course to take him through his first years. He would learn in chaos, being a born man, and after he reached adulthood, he would become responsible for himself. In his 6th week, just like Aban AB and Sealy AS, he had just the start of a bloodstream. Last week, he'd been nothing but a tube, the beginnings of a backbone and a spinal cord. This week, he had a tail, had spots for eyes, had the beginnings of a heart, and the faintest discernible buds for arms and legs. He didn't have a brain yet. He didn't have eyelids because he didn't really have eyes. Any of the three of them could have been almost any mammal. Gerard could have been a piglet, as easily, or a horse. He could have been Aban or Sealy. He could just as well have been a little girl, for that matter. But the DNA in his cells and the tag on his vat both said he was Jordan Nye, a CIT, and he'd be a square-built man with sandy hair, large bones, and cold blue eyes. Going on rejuve at age 40 or so, give or take how well he took care of himself, he'd live to be around 133 Earth Standard years before the drug played out on him, and then he'd probably die of a heart attack. That was the blueprint of the last Jordan Nye, and this one was destined for the old Jordan Nye's power, someday. Unless someone threw the switch and stopped him. Ari Emery visited him today, out of curiosity, and with mixed emotions. She came with her 2 bodyguards, Florian and Catelyn, and she created a stir in the labs. Even at 18, she had power, and she could throw that switch. She could also create Gerard's brother, Denys, completing the set on any given day. She still had 7 years leeway in which to do that, that span of time having been the gap between the brothers. In her own untested opinion, any day would do. But doing it at all was, personally, a very hard decision. For one thing, psychogenesis wasn't going to be a sure thing in the Nye's case. Regenesis Labs didn't have the data on the Nyes that they'd had on her, whose predecessors every living day had been documented down to the hormones, the chemistry, the actions, and the reactions, for at least her formative years. The first Ariane Emery had been her own mother, Olga Emery's living lab, and all her predecessors' data was out there in a vault under a grassy hill, just beyond the sprawling city-sized complex that was Regenesis, with Regenesis Labs and its adjacent town. This Ariane Emery was the second of her own gene set, and all her data was being saved under another such hill, so she was already pretty sure there'd someday be a third of her set. Like an Azzy, she supposed she could view continuance of her gene set as a vote of confidence by those who made such decisions. But whether they'd clone the original, or her, well, that was still to determine, wasn't it? Successful cloning was a given for Regenesis Labs, an easy job. Cloning human beings or rare animals with gene manipulation tossed in for variety, or, more to the point, for good health, that was what Regenesis and other labs did every day of the month, for the whole star-spanning state that was Union. You wanted a child of your own genotype, or just a roll of the dice, the old-fashioned way? If you passed the psych exams, male or female, you could have a child, 2 children, as many as you liked, or as many as your local law allowed. You wanted a genetic problem fixed? Regenesis could do that. Embryos shipped constantly, shuttled up to station, dispersed as far as Union reached, even, though rarely, to Earth. It was a huge industry. Regenesis had the largest of the CIT birth labs, but it had competition. Psychogenesis, however, replicating a mind, that was a whole new twist on an old process, and only Regenesis had done that. It was the year 2424, and this Ari Emery was the first success of that kind. She could create Denys, if she wanted to. She'd killed Denys, at least her bodyguard had. Gerard and Denys had created her, right after they had, perhaps, killed the first Ari Emery. Turnabout. Fair play. Book 1, Section 1, Chapter 2. April 21, 2424, 1509 hours. If you do exist, third Arian, and if you're hearing my record, with or without the first Arians, be warned that I intend to shape the world that you will inhabit. But be warned, too, I can never utterly guarantee the outcome of what I do, or the outcome of what I am. Fixing anything that's wrong will be your job, the same way the first Ari created me to fix her mistakes. So I give you this advice. You have my gene set, and you may be shaped by many of my experiences, as I was shaped by the first Arians. But remember, you're no more me than I am you. You're no more me than you, or I, can ever be the first Arian Emery, no matter how carefully they pattern us. Why? Because we don't live in her time. We can't live her life exactly as she lived it, and we shouldn't try, because then we wouldn't fit into the world we live in. You don't live in my time, and should never try to. This I do have in common with her. Mine is not a peaceful time. Not all the decisions she made were the best ones, and she knew that long before she died. In many cases, we both did as we could, too late for good sense. But I am certainly more the first Arian than you can be, since the times in which I exist are directly linked to her time. The times I'll shape, with whatever power I can get into my hands, will link me to your time. I don't know how I'll feel decades from now, but it's my opinion that you'll ultimately need to hear from both of us, because the first Ari invented herself, and I'm the bridge between. Do the math. The first Ari died 20 years ago. I'm 18. I've been living on my own since I was 12, because they preferred me to any other alternatives they had, most of which were bad. And, never mind that your records may insist that I was 14 when I set out on my own, I was 12. The program just wasn't ready for me, so it said I was 14, and I had to scramble to catch up. I owe my current situation to Dr. Yanni Schwartz, who saw Regenesis through difficult years, and who followed the program laid out in the first Ari's systems. If you know the records, the first Arian came to adult rights early. So did I. Both events were driven by legislators who feared their alternatives far more than they feared a child, or her overseers. Mine is still not in unlimited power in my 18th year. I wasn't born with a parental replicate's rights. I didn't even have my CIT number. I had to prove genetic identity before I got possession of Ari's old CIT number and became the owner of everything attached to it. Everything the first Ari owned. And I got it primarily because Regenesis wanted those rights to stay in Regenesis. So Regenesis backed my claims. But it didn't prove in all senses that I was Arian Emery. I'm still doing that, and people still question. Yanni Schwartz is director of Regenesis as well as proxy counselor for science. Yanni Schwartz is director of Regenesis as well as proxy counselor of science for Union, a situation which won't last forever, possibly not much beyond 2 years, or maybe longer. You'll know by your own lifetime how that transition of power played out, what I had to do, what I chose to do, and whether it was the best thing to have done. I'm pretty sure you'll get the CIT number attached before you're born. I'll try to see to that, since I fought that battle and there's no longer an issue. But no matter how much I can smooth the way for you, you'll likely face your own crisis of maturity, because money and power in the hands of a child make for powerful politics. Just say that right now my uncles are both dead, and I'm alive. This, too, you should know. The Council of Nine always preferred me over the alternatives, one of which was for Council to actually make a decision and plot a course away from the world that the first Ariane created. They didn't do that. Possibly the lack of initiative was planned into them. You know that Rezun had a hand in Novgorod's population. I've not gotten anything from my predecessor that gives me a specific clue about that theory. But then I don't have access to all of the records that exist, even if I'm told I have it. One can't prove a negative, and if I haven't got it, it's hard to know if it exists. But I'm still searching. My best theory says the Council might have hated the first Ariane, but they were scared of life without her. And getting her back, in me, that felt much safer for them. At least the court voted to give me my identity, even if they couldn't give me control of Rezun. Denys was responsible for pushing that. Nobody knew it then, since Gerard was the face they saw, but don't believe the histories. It was a combination of Gerard and Denys who really ran things, and Denys was brighter, but he was, let me say, a little odd. When Uncle Denys died, I overcame his base in the house systems. I'd already opened up all of Base 1, Ari's computer system, and gotten it to give me its records. I investigated all sorts of things that Denys had put under seal. Denys wasn't the one who'd walled me off from knowing things. Base 1 had done that. But when it was time, Base 1 was really his downfall. He couldn't seal the things the first Ariane had done when Base 1 was ready to tell me. The little surprises in the computer system, the sudden appearance of which to this hour I can't predict, just happen, and they began happening years before Denys died. That's how she got past Denys, posthumously, by installing the program that taught me step by step what she wanted me to know. She created areas of the house system no one knew existed, and she did it so that, after she was dead, Base 1 would wait, intact, never letting Base 2 rename itself. Then, when I reached the right age and the right circumstances, Base 1 assembled itself. In my case, I suspect the trigger was not my birthday, as I used to believe, but a combination of moves by my caretaker. I'm pretty sure Denys thought he could turn me into a useful but much safer version of my predecessor, but that didn't happen. Understand, Base 1 isn't a computer. It's always a moving target within the software of the main house system, and there's no knowing what it will be by the time you inherit it. Denys's experts couldn't find its parts, they couldn't shut it down without consequences, and it self-heals and adapts. So far as I know, it will still go on triggering things in your time, and I don't think that Uncle Denys's experts could do anything on their own that ever matched it, but I'm never sure, so I am careful, and so must you be. Never take Base 1 entirely for granted. You have to ask it very good questions to get its best and truest answers, and never assume the other bases won't maneuver to get past it. Evidently, Base 1 has opened some of my files to you, so I assume that you have reached a birthday or a crisis of some kind, and that your own accession to power is very near. Are you, in fact, 18 as you read this? I have no way to know. At this stage, I can't govern the age at which you get this, because I can't create the complexity of program that the first Ari wrote into Base 1. I'll learn. For now, I just make the records. So maybe you're 12. Maybe you're out on your own. Maybe not. I do assume that I'm dead by this time in your life, and that I have been since before your life began, by a few days, or maybe by some few months. It may have been my murder that brought about your birth. I shouldn't actually be surprised at that. And if that is what did happen to me, consider your own safety. They may have decided to create you, thinking they can control you, and Rezun's money. And when they find out to the contrary, they'll change their minds fast. Uncle Denys certainly did. Look around you. Ask who profited by my death, whether or not it was natural causes. I'm still asking that question about Ari I. Someone killed her. Someone ordered the termination of the first Florian and the first Catelyn, too, and curiously that makes me madder than someone killing my predecessor. If you don't feel much the same on that matter, we're different, and you should think really carefully about that. You have the intelligence to see why it should be dangerous, or we are very, very different indeed, and something critical to our nature has failed. Whoever killed Ari I, the plan to create me was already far advanced when she died, and my life went forward, in one sense, with the push of a button. You may know a lot about that by now, and likely you'll hear more about me as the years pass. You may know how I grew up, and you may know how I reacted to what they did. I learned to play their games. I was cute at the right moments. Uncle Denys saw through that because cuteness was completely wasted on him. He was a very inward person, pretending to be a good, sweet uncle. He relied on me for his power, because he couldn't hold it without someone to do the public things, and for a long time that was Gerard, and at the last it was me. He didn't know how to be nice, just how to act nice, and people believed he cared, but he didn't. When I figured that out, things changed. When Uncle Gerard died, I think that was when Uncle Denys really began to be scared, because Gerard had always been his protection and his public face. I'm sure Denys was more and more afraid of me as I grew. He was so afraid of me, and I think of Yanni, that he never found a way to kill me in time. And I think that was his game. I think he wanted me to get the first Ari CIT number. I think he wanted me to get everything I could and convince everybody I was real, which put a lot of money and power into his hands. When I nearly broke my neck, he was really upset. But he always planned I'd die before I got smarter than he was. He never knew when the right moment was, because he could judge how to make people trust him, but he couldn't do that so well once they got older and began to pretend to trust him. That was a very, very great weakness. And if the Denys I create grows up to be Denys the way he was, he might or might not be better at his games. So be careful. I do have ultimately to make a decision about Uncle Denys. Brilliant as he was in his field, he's not essential to the universe. But I'm nearly certain Uncle Gerard may need him once he's born. Gerard is important to us, and it might be important that my Gerard have a brother he can take care of, speak for, and protect obsessively. Not to have Uncle Denys born might change Gerard, maybe not for the better, though I have as long as 7 years before I make the ultimate decision on that. I won't prejudice your thinking about Gerard, supposing my version of him is in your life. Or maybe a third is, who knows? He could outlive me, and you might well have to deal with the Gerard I created. How I create him, and whether I ultimately create Denys for him to focus on, has bearing on what kind of Gerard you'll have. So pay close attention to what I say on that subject. You're not in power yet. You need to start taking measures to protect you. If you're not in power yet, you need to start taking measures to protect yourself and stay alive. Gerard can be pleasant, but he's capable of killing you. So I am leaning toward yes on the matter of Denys. Ultimately, I liked Gerard. I didn't like him most of the time he was alive, really, not as much as I like him in retrospect. One thing I know. I have to keep myself somewhat distant from the Gerard yet to be born, and not to let my feelings for the old one enter into his upbringing. He has to oppose me. That's what his use is. The first Gerard always wanted to belong to something, or he wanted something to belong to him. He had to serve something. He wasn't inclined, like me, like you, like the first Ari, to covet a solitary eminence. He had an Azi's need to serve, in a certain sense. In his case, he served Denys, and I find that need fascinating. Proving, I suppose, that one of the most universal and limiting traits we instill into the Azi we create is actually a profoundly human one. Gerard served his brother long before I existed, and after Gerard died, Denys was, I think, a sad and very unbalanced man. Denys began to take actions, being afraid of me, and not having Gerard any longer to keep the world away from him. That was what Denys most feared, you should know. Not me, not even dying. Denys was afraid of the world outside his world. And when Gerard died, Denys started having to do things for himself. He had very good Azi, Aban, of course, who had belonged to Gerard first, and he had Seelie, but they weren't Gerard. Worse, Denys didn't ever respect Azzy, not even Alpha Azzy, and that lack of respect coloured everything he ever did with them. They were loyal to him, they wanted to serve him, they did everything for him, but Denys couldn't respect anybody but Gerard. Born men, CITs, they were even more of a cipher to him, and he knew it. He had the program manuals for Aban and Seelie. He could read them very well, so he knew them as well as he knew any Azzy, and I'm sure he thought he understood them the way he thought he understood me. But to really understand either born men or Azzy, or me, you have to understand feelings, and Uncle Denys was all turned inward. He understood what he wanted. He could predict what Uncle Gerard was going to do most of the time. He actually trusted Gerard, and after Uncle Gerard died, Denys didn't trust anybody. He probably had confidence that Aban and Seelie would do what their manuals said they had to do, but here's the salient part. He didn't, I think, have the least idea why they would do it. He was so far from being able to deal with Azzy on an individual level, it's a wonder he got a non-provisional supervisor's certificate. I'm sure he finagled it, or Gerard got it for him. But don't ever think he didn't know Azzy in the macro sense. He really did. His writings are brilliant on economics stemming from Azzy populations turned CIT, macro sets in the largest sense, and profound integrations. I very, very much respect that work, and I'm still reading it. And personally, one-on-one, he could smile and be sweet. He did favours for people, and he could tell in talking to them just what they wanted to hear. Oh, he'd give them just exactly what would make them relax and believe him, and he could read that the way you'd read a book. But all that understanding of what people wanted to hear never got inside him, where he really lived. Inside he was all numbers, just numbers, and all the macro view, nothing micro at all. Much as I loathed Aban and Seelie, I know he mishandled them terribly, and that may be their destiny again, because they'll be his when he needs them. Maybe you see the situation clearer than I do, because emotions both make things clearer and obscure the truth. You can understand and manipulate people without experiencing empathy. Sociopaths do that really well, but if you don't know very clearly what your own objective is in that transaction, you can't really understand what your own emotions are doing to you, and it's easy to get confused. You can think you're being really smart when you're really just getting by. I think that was Denys's central trouble. He had a lot of the traits of a sociopath, totally self-interested, no empathy even for Gerard. And it's not a flaw in him I feel safe correcting yet, or we could lose everything he was, intellectually. I'm just beginning work on my section of the tape you'll get, and maybe I won't tell you everything I could say right now, because you have to figure certain things out for yourself. My current decision is to let Ari I talk to you first, with the very same tape she gave to me, starting with your first log-on to Base 1. For one thing, because it exists, and I can't predict how long I'll live. If things turn out the way I plan, you'll have heard her voice for years before you hear mine. So you'll come to know me, starting with this tape, if I haven't created any others to precede it. One thing is relatively sure, that you won't remember me. But you may know Justin, and Grant, and Yanni, and maybe you'll deal with my Amy and Sam and Maddie, and maybe even my Florian and my Catelyn, whom I love above all the world, though I may have to order them to die. They're too powerful, and I honestly don't know what they'd do without me, or if they could love an Ari who isn't theirs. Most of all, they couldn't be children with you. But I don't want to think about that. Of all the things I suspect Ari I did, that's the one I can't stand. And yet it may have been absolutely necessary. It may have been the hardest and the kindest thing she ever did. I can't think what would have happened if I hadn't had my Florian and my Catelyn when I was growing up. It would have changed everything. You see why, with all the questions I haven't answered for myself, I may let Ari Sr. talk to you first. She never grew too old for questions, but she could give you answers from a much longer view. That isn't my perspective yet. I hope I have her years to gain that sense. I hope I leave things in better order for you than she did for me. But I can't promise it. So, hello, Ariane, in case we've never met before. I can't call myself your mother, because we're probably both 18, and maybe when I'm old I'll make early tapes for you, the way Ari Sr. did for me, and you can decide what to do and which to give your own successor, or whether your successor should exist at all. The world shouldn't just repeat itself. The advice the first Ari gave me may not apply to the world forever. Most of all, I'm sorry for all you've been through. I understand. Of all people who've ever existed, I know what you've been through to get here. Hello, from a sister. Maybe that's the way to think of me. Hello, and don't treat anybody but your Florian. Oh, hello, and don't trust anybody but your Florian and your Catelyn. If you don't have them, then someone has betrayed you. Book 1, Section 1, Chapter 3. April 21, 2424. 1448 hours. Ari flicked the camera off. Session ended. How would she look to future eyes? Like mirror into mirror for a girl who wasn't born yet? Someone in an odd, outmoded style of dress telling another 18-year-old things she didn't want to believe were true? She couldn't help the outmoded part. Her successor would see that tape at least on reaching her majority. That was the current plan, granted she, or someone, authorized her successor to exist. She would be the one to lay down the protocols under which her successor would get full access to that tape or any tape. She would decree the time at which the data and operational system that was Base 1 would open up to her successor. On some future day of upheaval, or simply on an otherwise significant birthday, her successor would log on to her computer for the day, and Base 1 would start to tell her things that would shake her world. Her own wake-up had come early. The program Ari Sr. had written had made decisions and advanced the date of her majority and her assumption of power, catching Denys totally off guard. Was it wise of Ari to have done that? Yes. She was alive, and Denys wasn't. She hadn't exactly killed Denys, but her defenses were indisputably lethal. Fingers flew on the keys now that she hit the programming part, which she liked far better than talking into the camera. She'd keyboarded and coded since she could remember, and did this part without thinking too much about the process, at least in replicating routines she'd lifted from the files that had taught her. The hands flew very fast as she linked modules, which was like taking chunks of thinking, like building blocks, and dragging them all together into a coherent program. Her moves dictated what would flow from that first session, and moved the DEFCONs Ari Sr. had created for her own tapes into position to protect and assess and seal that session from anyone's future deletion, even her own later second thoughts. That was the way it worked, at least on the level she worked at inside Base 1. She needed to be better than she was, but she was good enough for this. She wouldn't be able to get in and tamper, no matter if she had better thoughts later. If she interfered with what she was now, she couldn't get her successor to be who she would be. How was that for Klein bottle thinking? Book 1, Section 1, Chapter 4. April 22, 2424. 11:21 hours. Pre-lunch meeting in a small conference room not on the agenda. Dr. Sandur Patil, Yanni Schwartz, was notified, had entered the Bureau of Science, was downstairs at the moment, and on her way up. It wasn't an extraordinary event. A professor registered in science entered the offices of that bureau in Novgorod. But it was uncommon that such a visit would reach the attention of the proxy counselor for science, and more unusual still that it would bring said counselor to put on his coat and head down the hall to the back entry to an anonymous conference room. In the capital, in an environment rife with media ferrets and political gossips, Yanni Schwartz found time, personally, to meet with Patil by a circuitous route. Technically, she was one of his constituents, since Dr. Sandy Patil was a scientist, still registered to vote in science, and he was proxy counselor of that bureau, de facto counselor. Lynch, erstwhile Secretary of Science, had been proxy counselor when Giraud died. Lynch had become counselor for science by succession, with the right to appoint a new proxy counselor, Yanni. So Yanni sat and voted in sessions, even though Lynch was in the city. Oh, that's a colon there. Whoops, my bad. So Yanni sat and voted in sessions, even though Lynch was in the city. It was a valid vote unless Lynch should rise up and repudiate it, which Lynch wasn't going to do, being a timid sort, and the office stayed, de facto, in Raizun, where it had always been. And being director of Raizun, as well as proxy counselor, Yanni wielded a certain power as head of the Expansionist Party, which meant what he did politically was usually policy setting in that party. That was why, if any of the reporters outside the building had seen him meeting with Sandy Patil, it would have drawn notice. Dr. Patil being a particular darling of the centrist cause, adored by the radical fringe of that group, though the majority of those registered in science were expansionist. She had voted against Jordan Nye, that was a near certainty. Now she arrived and proceeded as if she had business somewhere in the mundane administrative offices downstairs, some matter of records or certifications. Then took the lift straight up to the administrative third floor, where a good centrist was decidedly in foreign territory. Yanni entered the conference room. His Aussie companion, Frank, was with him, but Frank went on through to the foyer. He had no other security present, unusual in itself for a director of Raizun. His visitor, upward bound, didn't have a wire or a bug. The moment she walked into the lift, Frank had made sure she was clean. She likely would expect someone like Frank to sit in on the meeting, but she had seemed skittish of this dealing. Yanni was forewarned of that, so he stationed Frank in the anteroom and settled alone at the head of the conference table, waiting. About, he trusted, to find out what Patil thought of the offer she'd gotten 3 months ago. I need time to think, she'd told the Raizun aides who'd initially contacted her. They'd warned her that any indiscretion would cancel the offer. And for 3 months she hadn't talked to anyone. Not that they'd been able to... Sorry. Ugh. They'd warned her that any indiscretion would cancel the offer. And for 3 months she hadn't talked to anyone. Not that they'd been able to track. That was encouraging. Are the papers I have still valid? She'd asked, via the same contacts, after Denys Nye's assassination. Yes, she'd been told. She'd asked for a meeting with other aides last week, which was too much potential for noise. Yanni had insisted she meet with him this week, face to face. The Council of 9 was in session. The vote on a critical bill was at hand. So she came to the science offices and hadn't talked to any reporters. That cooperation didn't surprise him. Patil had lived very quietly, avoided the news so far as she could, had gone silent when controversy had tried to attach to her name. And she'd been one around whom political storms could very easily have formed. She had common sense. She was an expert in her field. Centrists backed her. He had everything arranged to make it a bipartisan deal, if the interview went well. It was just the reporters and the public they didn't want informed. The woman who entered the conference room, Frank showed her in and left again, was 40-ish in appearance, but the record said she was past a century, on rejuve, clearly. She was blonde, wore a chignon of braids, which might be her own, with a stylish brown tweed suit and high black heels. Fashion plate. Compulsive in that regard. He'd heard that about her.
Dr. Patil,
Yanni said pleasantly, rising to offer his hand.
have a seat. Coffee?
Staff had provided a carafe with 2 cups. Yanni poured one for an opener. "Thank you," Patil said, and he poured another for himself.
Quarterly break for you, isn't it?
"Yes," Patil said in a flat tone, and took the coffee he handed her. Straight to business, then, with the warmth of a desert night. Yanni had a fortifying sip of his cup and sat down.
I know you've read the offer,
Yanni said. "I've read it," Patil said. The beginning didn't augur well. He had his own notorious temper, he knew Patil's reputation as a bitch, and he wasn't going to react. They were safe here, however, from the media and less stable elements of the population, and his contacts had indicated the woman was leaning toward acceptance. Discreet, difficult to read, and that was a plus in terms of the offer they'd made her. "And," he said, "not going to change your mind on this project?" she asked. Sore spot.
I assure you, Jordan Nye set this one in motion. It still moves.
The position would be wing director in Regenesis at Fraggoth.
Yes.
Inside Regenesis space.
Yes.
Under an ASI director. Well, there was a nasty little tone. Prejudice on that score occasionally did come from stationers, which she had been. It even occasionally turned up in the halls of Regenesis in certain places. It grated on him in a major way.
Oliver Strashen is a CIT now, Dr. Patil. He's been a CIT for some time. Social as they come, and I'm sure you'll enjoy his company.
Supposing I take this post, I'm to have this signal honor. Supposing I take this post, I'm to have this signal honor. He was, for one heartbeat, not sure they wanted her anywhere near ASI, let alone in charge of a program where there would be thousands. She was the best at what she did. That was one reason they'd approached her, that, along with her centrist connections. But she wouldn't be dealing with that aspect of the program. She'd be presiding over a station research installation, for cover, and she'd be well insulated.
The deal is sat on the table for 3 months, Dr. Patil. The deal... We've answered all your questions, I trust. You've been free to consult certain advisors. We appreciate your discretion. Now, do you have an answer for us?
Your influence, sir, got me hauled down onto this planet 2.5 decades ago, cancelled a guaranteed program, shoved me into a teaching position, which is another honor I'd rather not have had. So now you want to set me up now you want me to set up a lab, and I suppose you expect I should gratefully vote for you if you stand in the next elections. Oh, she was absolutely everything his aides had said. Brilliant, a special, a mind ranked as a national treasure. Specials weren't necessarily nice people. A lot of them were downright E.T. The woman's students either worshipped or hated her, according to their skills and personal tolerances. But still they enrolled. Nobody cared about a special's manners where it came to her work.
We haven't said a thing about your voting your conscience, which I trust, being an ethical woman, you will do wherever you're based. Hell, stand for science yourself. You always could have done that.
Correction. Not easy in a military bubble where politics has kept me for decades. Equally inconvenient to do that from a Regenesis security bubble at the end of space where you want to send me. I detest the military. I detest Regenesis. And you want me to work under a local Regenesis director who is absolutely guaranteed to be a by-the-book rule follower. Ah, That was the concept. Maybe not an entirely irrational prejudice.
If you knew Ollie Strassen, you wouldn't hold that opinion, and I'd have thought you'd gotten tired of graduate theses. You got caught in a situation, let me remind you, I didn't personally choose. I still support the decision, for the record, but this post I'm offering you is vastly different, and it may, I hope, make some amends for your time in purgatory. Fargon is a very comfortable place.
And I'd be under stringent security.
You were under that security at Beta, which has far fewer amenities than Fargon.
And how long would I be there? Eventually, I foresee a hardscrabble station orbiting a snowball.
A living laboratory. Your laboratory, should you ever choose to view that world in person. But I think the proposal makes it clear. You'll never be required to leave Fargon Station. You'll work in a civilized, state-of-the-art laboratory, handling everything from there. A 3-month lag in information, necessarily, 6 on the query to the object of your operations and back again, but you'll be in civilized surroundings under a perfectly innocuous cover, so long as you yourself choose to be.
Give it a few years, and he'd bet that Eversnow would draw her out onto the site. Hands-on work, a whole world for a lab, would draw Sandy Patil like an addiction. He knew her history. She'd eventually get exasperated with the 6-month time lag on her results and go to Eversnow herself, if she'd take the post in the first place. And nothing he had thus far heard from her discouraged him from enlisting her.
Let me be perfectly open with you, he said quietly. Yes, you got an infamously bad deal during the war.
I got an infamously bad deal, damned right. Yanked out of my own research, lured onto this dustball for a huge program I worked on for 15 years that got cancelled 6 weeks before it was implemented, largely thanks to Rezune. Pardon me if I have just a little apprehension about agreeing to another Rezune operation.
There'll be no going back on this.
Patil stared at him, dark eyes in a pale face surrounded by pale hair, and right now there was no beauty, nothing but harsh, hard assessment. And how long will you stay in office, Proxy Counselor? And how long until this kid comes along and cancels everything I'm working on, just the way her predecessor did? Blunt question.
We advance it now, he said carefully. We get the project implemented. That way there'll be no profit in not going ahead, and there'll be, let me remind you, nothing like the die-off zones, nothing like Woolwood. Or Platytheres.
It's a damn snowball.
It's a Cyteen-class planet in a 1,000,000-year deep freeze. Remember, you'll sit at Fargon, safe and warm and in all the comforts. You can socialize with Rezune staff, or not, at your pleasure, so long as you maintain cover. And you'll have a planet to work with, a 30 billion cred budget for the next several years, and the warming, let me breach a little security here, is advanced beyond our first projections. We're going to jumpstart it with a few limited impacts this year, followed up by 5 more solar satellites, as well as the research station. How fast can you push it if we gave you a wide-open budget? And once it's that far advanced, how soon until you no longer have to maintain cover?
Lips went thin, but the eyes held thought. A lot of it. Fast. Still a lot of practical unknowns with a snowball. Deep ocean. How much life is on the sea floor? How complex? You've got samples. The military is dialing up the heat with not a notion in hell what they're doing beyond polluting it with the Earth biome and making themselves a nice little salt puddle. Brilliant. Is Eversnow life going to fight back? And how hard? And what kind of mess do we have if you change your mind on this one midway?
This will be a centuries-long program, with a massive budget on a bipartisan agreement. It incidentally gets you out from under defense, back into science, and gives you absolute authority about what drops onto that world, which may be some little incentive.
Guarded look after a furtive spark. He had her. Maybe.
So do you want your name on it? Yes or no? It's yours, if you want it. No communications restrictions. Free access to Fargon, free access to Cyteen beta by ship mail, no damn censoring of my articles for publication once the lid comes off, and a 2,000 standard kilo personal goods allowance. That mass was a heart-stopper, if it had been just any traveler. The usual was 40 standard kilos. No censorship on publication or scientific cross-communication, even with Earth and Alliance. That was worrisome, but it was no longer wartime, and the lid was off. They just weren't used to it. And the ridiculous personal goods travel allowance was minuscule compared to the equipment they'd be moving out there. A whole lab, containerized to the farthest station down that strand of stars. No communications restrictions, he agreed. No publication restrictions. Once the cover goes off, not from Regenesis admin, not from legislature. What we intend to have known publicly for the short-term cover story, For what we intend to have known publicly for the short-term cover story, you'll run a new Regenesis Space Lab division at Fargon, having to do with medical nanistics, in a very secure facility. Regenesis itself will pay transport out, and it will pay transport back if you decide at any point that you want to resign the post. Your 2,000 kilo freight allowance, all right, granted. I'll throw in a resettling bonus, apartment paid, station share paid, unless you go out to Eversnow, and then you'll have to take that station as it is. But you'll be in on a founder's station share, on what's slated to be a major way station down that strand of stars. Tell me where you can get that nowadays. You'll have $10K a month with equal pension when you retire. That's the same as any wing director in Regenesis. Out there, in Fargon's economy, that $10K and apartment and station share is pretty damn extravagant. Money's not the issue. Freedom is. I'm spied upon, followed. For 25 damn years I'm hounded by Cyteen police, Regenesis security, defense MPs. I'm aware of that, and you know why. I don't control what shows up at the public library. What shows up at your lectures is a problem you didn't choose and don't cultivate. We know that. Here, you're a magnet for people with agendas. You won't have that problem at Fargon. For one thing, you won't have to give any public lectures. I don't, frankly, encourage any publicity for the initial period without cover, when, shall we say, political interest in your project is likely to be intense, even on Fargon. But there's no Paxer problem on Fargon, no abolitionists to speak of, or if there are, they're the polite sort who simply write condemnatory letters to the station bulletin board, nothing violent. We appreciate that you've been discreet throughout your career. We have no doubts of your character, your credentials, give or take a certain bias toward voting the opposition in science. We certainly have no doubts of your administrative abilities in a lab operation, and none about your scientific expertise. You'll be able to pick your staff from Beta. You have absolute authority there. But I do need an answer, or I need to start looking out at Beta very quickly, because we are going to a vote tomorrow, and I'm going to have some idea who we can put in. The bill will pass. I can present it for a vote with your name attached by cloakroom rumor, or not. We have a few Regenesis personnel we could send out there, with less need of security, but you're our first choice, one both sides of the aisle can agree on. And this is your one chance to ride it all the way from tomorrow's vote to fund a medical nanistics lab, the project you're signing on to. What time frame for my going out there? Your departure within 3 months. I'm not sure I can make that deadline. I have a residence. I have classes. I have to pack. You'll receive considerations. If you can't sell the residence in the time provided, someone will buy it. That's no problem. Set aside what you want to take. If you're close, but a little over, between you and me, we can forgive a few kilos. Someone will have to take your classes. A shift of position in the chair, a deep breath. Tell me, does the Emery girl have any idea what you're doing? Why? He shrugged. While I'm director of Regenesis, I am director of Regenesis. We have an understanding. A line deepened between her brows. You mean I'll be erasing the next administration of Regenesis? I do appreciate the honesty. It's been rare from your district. I think the level of support you'll have from her lies partly in your hands. Did I mention to you that Oliver A.O. Strassen is a person she regards as a father, and his word carries an enormous weight with her? God, he'd loved delivering that small punch. It got a blink of those dark eyes, a sudden reassessment of biases, realities, and the worth of Oliver Strassen. It drew her deeper and deeper into visualizing herself integrating into the society she'd live in. First step in a good sales job. If your operation is running well, he continued, well documented, all the earmarks of the project it ought to be, I'm sure Ollie Strassen's word will carry an enormous weight with her. It's a big boost for Fargon's economy. That's a great plus. I think when Sarah Emery assesses what is out there now, and what you'll have done by then, she'll agree. This is your project, on a platter. All the work you did back at the turn of the century can go into practical application. That is, if you want the job. A snowball. A damn snowball. A snowball third from its sun with liquid water, an Earth genome puddle, and warming fast. And I assure you, Fargon Station is absolutely the equivalent of Cyteen Station, all the amenities, an active social scene, even luxury, every luxury you could ask. You'll be well able to afford it. You know how a wing director can live. She drew a deep breath. Have you got the paperwork? I have it, Yanni said, and quietly opened the folder on the table. The next meeting of the day was not on science turf. It was over across the ring of the Bureau Towers, under a hazy seaside sky, in the Defense Tower, and Yanni went there with his full entourage, pursued by an unruly handful of reporters who'd followed him over from science, into a reception made doubly noisy by reporters hanging about the portico of defense. The news services sensibly hoped an unannounced visit from the proxy counselor of science to the defense tower might have some meat to it, with the Council of the Nine in session and now in a one-day recess for reading and consultation. It was a particularly good story, since elections were in progress in defense, and Khalid, who had had a notably bad relationship with young Emery, was running against Sperlin, who was only slightly friendlier to Rezun. Current Counselor for Defense, Jacques, who'd been chair-warming for the old warhorse, Gorodin, who had just died in the post of proxy counselor, it was all very tangled, had not opted to defend his seat, but he had appointed Sperlin to be proxy counselor in the interim, so it was a wide-open and nasty contest. There had been talk Jacques might even resign and let Sperlin run as an incumbent. But it hadn't happened. "Are you pressuring Jacques to resign?" a reporter shouted at him, and another, "Do you have any comment, proxy counselor?" He wasn't throwing morsels of business to the media. Not on this. Not before the public deal was done. But he stopped, faced cameras, smiled in the sunny way that he'd learned to put on when he was wearing his legislative persona. "There are a few items on the agenda that make sense to discuss with the outgoing counselor." "This is an unscheduled meeting, right?" "Wide-ranging discussion on a number of issues where we can reach consensus. A few on budgetary matters." If there was anything to make a reporter's eyes glaze over, budget was it. Budget could lead to absolutely unmarketable footage, unless corruption was in it. And it wasn't. Actually, and for once, corruption wasn't the issue, and Jacques himself was never news. Actually, and for once, corruption wasn't the issue, and Jacques himself was never news. Frank and black-uniformed Rezun Sec had meanwhile opened an avenue for him toward the door, and during that second of glaze-over he took it, while building security held the doors. Press was allowed to besiege the outdoor carport. They couldn't, however, block the lobby. Upstairs via the lobby lift, in relative calm, up to the 14th floor. As proxy counselor for defense, Sperlin had an office there. Khalid's was somewhat higher up,
clear up on Cyteen Station, as happened, and that was about as close as Yanni hoped to see him. It wasn't a loving relationship, even so, his personal acquaintance with Sperlin. His own predecessor, Jordan Nye, had had a relatively cozy relationship with Defense when Gorodin was in office, much less so with Khalid. The first Ari had at least a reasonably good one with Azov, and then Gorodin, during the war years when Defense had to rely heavily on Raziun. But young Ari had started a war with Defense and ruffled some egos mightily, especially Khalid's. Sperlin remained a bit of a cipher, but he was far more acceptable to Raziun. Votes were coming in electronically, ship-mailed from time-lagged stations, to be opened simultaneously on Cyteen Station as polls closed on Cyteen itself. That would happen in July, given the longest round trip of messages, which was far gone. But he owned one advantage in going into a negotiation with Defense. Whoever ended up at the... Oh gosh, I cannot read right now. One sec.
Oh no! Oh, don't mind me, just wrong tubing it. Hey, become an amphibian. Put water in your lungs. Where were we? Right. Let's just take the paragraph from the top. Votes were coming in electronically, ship-mailed from time-lagged stations, to be opened simultaneously on Cyteen Station, as polls closed on Cyteen itself. That would happen in July, given the longest round trip of messages, which was far gone. But he owned one advantage in going into a negotiation with Defense, whoever ended up at the helm. Defense could look forward to a few years of fairly reasonable, low-key Yanni Schwartz before they had to deal with sharp-witted and adult Ari II, whose agendas were as yet unknown. And the military didn't like unknowns. It preferred the devil they knew. Khalid, if he won, certainly had rather deal with him, and Sperlin certainly didn't want him making any cozy deals with Khalid. Jacques... Nobody cared, nowadays, what Jacques thought. He took Frank in with him on this one, Frank carrying a briefcase that never strayed far from his side. Communications, that was. Defense knew it, probably had a truther aimed at the room, would run electronic surveillance to see if any signal went out from that briefcase, and God knew what other probes it brought to bear, trying to penetrate the secrets in it. Yanni didn't sit down. No, I'm not okay. I'm drowning. Drowning myself. It turns out, lungs don't like having water poured straight into them.
Thank you for asking, though. Jeez Louise. I do appreciate it, I think.
I'd appreciate it more if I didn't just, pour water straight into my breathing tubes. Oh no.
Did we do... I'll just reread that little mini paragraph. He took Frank in with him on this one, Frank carrying a briefcase that never strayed far from his side. Communications, that was. Defense knew it, probably had a truther aimed at the room, would run electronic surveillance to see if any signal went out from that briefcase, and God knew what other probes it brought to bear, trying to penetrate the secrets in it. Yanni didn't sit down. Since there was no Sperlin as yet, he made himself at home. He drew Frank a cup of coffee, indicated a chair to the side, where Frank ensconced himself. They'd been together lifelong, he and Frank, close as brothers. He wasn't comfortable outside Rezun when circumstances excluded Frank, was much more at ease in a room where Frank was, and he took himself and a second cup of coffee to a seat at the oversized conference table. Sperlin came in, a walking stormfront of a man, with uniformed aides who dispensed papers, water, glasses, and old-fashioned pens and notepads. God knew what they were supposed to do with those. The aides settled primly around the edges. An ache hit the roots of Yanni's teeth as Sperlin lowered his wide-shouldered, uniformed, and bemedaled bulk over to the head into... The aides settled primly around the edges. An ache hit the roots of Yanni's teeth as Sperlin lowered his wide-shouldered, uniformed, and bemedaled bulk into the head chair. A silencer had started running to prevent any eavesdropping. "Admiral," Yanni said with a dip of his head. "Sir," Sperlin answered. It had a note of question. "Patil just agreed to terms," Yanni said plainly. "No alterations worth mentioning except a 2,000-kilo mass limit and freedom to publish after the cover's lifted." He eased back in his chair, a little less ramrod straight. "Well, so we're all go." "We're go." "We'll handle communication with our own people at Fargon. There's a freighter going out on the 24th. "Skip the freighter. No Alliance transport." Freighters were that, Alliance merchanters plying the routes between Union stations. "We have a courier. It can leave after the vote tomorrow." Low mass, big engines, faster by a classified number of days, especially if the courier was ready to launch. And no Alliance snoopery, though if they black boxed it, there was no likelihood of Let's try that again. Low mass, big engines, faster by a classified number of days, especially if the courier was ready to launch. And no Alliance snoopery, though if they black boxed it, there was no likelihood Alliance would snoop at all. Yanni nodded. If speed is an issue, we have the appropriate orders ready. We can make your schedule." You were that convinced she'd do it," Sperlin said. "I thought she would, yes," Yanni said. "A research scientist with a life's work project backed up on hold for decades? I was very sure she'd do it." "Her Paxer constituency really isn't going to like her taking a Rezun post. Domestic security had better take hold and look sharp when that news breaks." The Paxers, the peace party, had fallen on hard times after the war. They weren't the threat they had been. They'd had a spate of bombings. A certain number of their intellectuals showed up at Patil's public lectures. So, shadier and more violent, did a few of the Rocher party, the abolitionists. It's either that or Rocher. I'm not really sure. I'm going to go with Rocher. So, shadier and more violent, did a few of the Rocher party, the abolitionists. But it was a public forum, the Franklin Lecture Series, sponsored by a centrist-leaning agricultural processing consortium, and as much as Patil's speeches usually generated web chatter, she didn't participate in the fringe element chat. She more or less politely dealt with everyone who actually showed up, but she had a sharp manner when asked a stupid question, and only the intellectuals tended to ask her questions, not the subway-bombing lunatic fringe. They probably lived in terror of her. So did the tea-sipping social set who'd attend any function on the library circuit. I'm going to reread that so it had any emphasis on the right syllables. There was, in my defense, a page break. She more or less politely dealt with everyone who actually showed up, but she had a sharp manner when asked a stupid question, and only the intellectuals tended to ask her questions, not the subway-bombing lunatic fringe. They probably lived in terror of her. So did the tea-sipping social set who'd attend any function on the library circuit. So did the tea-sipping social... So did the tea-sipping social set who'd attend any function on the library circuit.
Regenesis is going on alert when Patil's acceptance of a post goes public, Yanni said. My office will be on it, Sperlin said. Sperlin's specific office was system defense. He was a post-war admiral, never in combat. Khalid had that advantage, that he had fought against the Maziani, the former Earth Company fleet. But this is supposing it goes through. Corrain's not entirely a surety yet. It could all fall apart. I'm pretty confident he'll go with us on this, Yanni said. Lau's with us. That was no news. Lau of Information was battling Rejuve failure herself, another election they were going to suffer. But she was at the session, holding out on painkillers. Rezun's old friend. I'm scheduled to talk with Corrain this evening, but don't give any interviews until after the vote. It'll look bad. Sperlin had no sense of humor. At all. Your man at Fargon, the Azzy. CIT, Yanni corrected him. Ex-Azzy. Emery's man. Is he up to handling the security aspects of this? And what will he be telling the girl? I have less doubt of Ollie Strassen than I do of anyone else involved in this undertaking, sir. And he doesn't communicate with young Emery, never has. We have very efficient management out there. Check your records. So now you have a program. We will have a program. Yanni gave a small shrug. He wasn't really comfortable with Sperlin. The privacy screen made his sinuses ache. And he was anxious to have the meeting done, in token of which he drank half the very expensive cup of coffee at one go. Patil will be drawing her own complement from Beta Station, perfectly current with the research. So you'll have plenty of sources who will talk to you very nicely, I'm sure. A brow lifted. Sperlin looked marginally happier with that thought. The military fairly well ran Beta, and that was in system. Definitely familiar territory, familiar channels. So you get your new lab. And you get a planet, Yanni said wryly. Humanity gets a planet, Sperlin said. That was the theory. Humanity couldn't live on Pell without supplementals, and the fungi were lethal over time. Humanity couldn't actually live on Cyteen. If the Weathermakers and the Precip Towers ever failed, they were all dead in a day. Humanity did too damned well at surviving on Gehenna, and if all of them could turn up dead in a day, it would make everybody sleep easier at night. They hoped eventually to do better at Eversnow, a viable planet, one they could entirely terraform and render completely habitable, right down to the oxygen balance, and where people could come and go without turning themselves into such deeply acculturated specialists they couldn't integrate with spacefaring society. That all being in reference to the Gehenna situation. If you listened to 40,000 in, on, around, at something or other Gehenna, I can't actually remember the title. 40,000 in Gehenna? On Gehenna? It's one of those. 40,000 in Gehenna. There it is. I found it. If you haven't listened to that, that's okay. They've given you pretty much the basics of why that's relevant. And that book also, never really delves into the political situation that's all about. And that inflicts. It is a bit there, it pops up in, some of the memoranda that show up in the memos that people shoot at each other. But it's not really, not like in Cyteen, where it's here's the political ramifications of this action. It's about the sociological ramifications of that action. So it's very important. Ultimately, it's important much further down the road for Ari Emery. One of them, anyway. And not the only such planet hereafter. Once they'd proven the case and established the precedent for terraforming a marginal world, once they'd gotten past the emotional nonsense that bacteria counted as life on a world, young Emery would see the benefit. That meant activation of the arcs, a use for the stored genetics. A new Eden. A reserve Earth, in case the unthinkable ever happened. I have Patil's name on the contract, Yanni said. But first out there and setting up at Fargon Station will be Resume Sec. That didn't make Sperlin happy, but Yanni said it anyway. Resume Sec for a Resume installation. We'll establish connections, set up the labs. Our setup won't bother your military hospital there in the least. But where it regards our tech and birth labs, we don't admit anybody but Resume personnel. That never changes. Sorry. I wouldn't expect it to, Sperlin said, and, as if the admission were physically painful, added, Good. We're happy. We can back this. If we're elected, was the unspoken context, and science was backing him as far as it dared. Thank you, sir, Yanni said. I take it you're going to call on Jacques upstairs. Give him my regards. And Khalid. There it was, the direct challenge. I'll of course send the proposal up the station, Yanni said, and of course present it to Councillor Jacques. But I'm very glad to have this particular discussion face-to-face. Meaning Jacques was all but an afterthought, and the face-to-face he'd chosen had been with Sperlin, not Khalid. That had to please Sperlin. Good luck in the vote, Yanni said. He didn't mention the name Emery. Will of the people. Civilized understandings. We'll hope to keep in touch, however things turn out. There was a little flicker from Sperlin's eyes, a little consideration of that point, in the long-term realities of Union politics, that councillors could be challenged every 2 years, and narrowly rejected candidates often came back repeatedly, if not this time, then next. Yanni's bet, personally, was on Sperlin, who, whatever his lack of combat experience, was the better politician, and the polls were running that way. Pleasure, Sperlin said. Mutual, Yanni said, and rose and shook hands. No trail of documents, no outside witnesses. There would be a vid record, to be sure. Defense was rife with bugs. But he now had to go upstairs and explain to Jacques, who had actually cast the vote, that there was an understanding, and thank you so much for your help getting this far. Jacques' permanent retirement was a few months away, resignation from the military, given in a sinecure of corporate position. That had taken a little maneuvering, but Khalid would have beaten Jacques hands down, and no few people had moved to see Jacques step down fast and first, to make Sperlin look as attractive as possible. Subordinates would work out the details from this point on, and settle such things as a launch time for the military courier, bearing orders for Ollie Strassen, but not, of course, anticipating the formal vote in council. Those orders, on a data strip, he did leave with Sperlin, in a sealed envelope. The envelope, that old-fashioned precaution, wouldn't in the least stop Sperlin's people from getting into it, but it would occasion them just a little hesitation. A point of satisfaction, just to tweak their sensibilities, and they wouldn't learn a damned thing once they did. Once he'd told Ollie Strassen what he'd told Ollie Strassen in that message, he'd told Ollie in plain words, because Ollie had his training, had gone CIT, and, canny old Resume hand that Ollie was, from the innermost circles, he knew exactly what to make of the message. You're getting a new wing and a director who'll be under you. Keep it that way. She'll have notions of her own, but you're in charge. She'll have a hell of a budget. A detached module, clean room, and security lock, all on Resume's ticket, all strictest security. We're reviving the Eversnow project. Total security. She'll run it. She's all yours. He had his little pro forma meeting with Jacques, who was looking tired and overwhelmed these days, talking about his impending retirement and an apartment on Swigert Bay, and then Yanni ran the media gauntlet to the car, which delivered him and Frank back to the hotel in ample time for a little relaxation, a drink at the bar. And that lull offered a little opportunity for a side excursion. The hotel had a shop, and the shop window, on his way to the tower lift, had a certain trinket he wanted. He sent one of his staffers back down to buy it, gift-wrapped, and meanwhile Frank ordered supper catered to his suite. Supper for two, with a choice of entrees, with a later supper for himself. This was pure business. Critical business. He had time for a shower, a change of clothes, nothing too informal, however. He was combing his hair, no haircut really improved it, when hotel personnel arrived, dogged by Regenesis, who'd have superintended the meal from the start, and Frank let them in. They wheeled a cart in, set up the small table with a politely low arrangement of flowers, and set a pair of wine bottles onto cooling cradles, with 2 more in reserve. Not that they might crack a second one, but it was available, a choice of dry or not. And by the time they'd finished, Frank would deserve at least one survivor. Mikhail Corain of Citizens arrived on time at his door, with no aides, no entourage, and, hopefully, no reporters in train, unless someone had followed him up to... Sorry. Let's try that again. Mikhail Corain of Citizens arrived on time at his door, with no aides, no entourage, and, hopefully, no reporters in train, unless someone had followed him up to the 20th floor. It was a meeting that would have drawn attention, if reporters had been able to get past VIP security or accurately figure which of 14 high-profile guests Corain might be visiting. Corain was, besides Counselor for Citizens, the head of the centrist party, and he'd been in a career-long opposition to Regenesis. Certainly, if he could have consigned the First Emery to hell, Mikhail Corain would have been happy to see her off. Relations with Jordan Nye had been better, but they hadn't been warm. Relations with the Second Emery? Guarded. Very guarded. It wasn't good politics to attack a kid. Corain didn't look at all comfortable in coming here, but Yanni put on his best manners, pleasantly offered his hand, offered Corain a seat at the small dining table, while Frank politely and firmly stationed Regenesis personnel outside the door, not inside. Salad was local. The pork loin and the chicken were both Regenesis, and the wines were from Pell. The after-dinner coffee would be an Earth import. Sorry. The meal encompassed a significant half of human space. "So glad you were willing to come," Yanni said. "Pell Sauvignon or Riesling?" "The Sauvignon," Corain said, and Frank quietly prepared the bottle. "Frank," Corain said, by way of greeting and question. "Good evening, Frank." "Good evening, sir." Frank smiled at him, perfectly at ease in his unaccustomed role. "I'm doing the honors this evening. My discretion is impeccable. My service may not be, but I hope you'll forgive my slips." Corain nodded. Given his constituency, which One sec. Sorry about that. The struggle is real today. You get a couple coughs out, and man, the rest of the day, you're just like, oh my god, everything's awful. It takes just on a hair trigger. Okay, where were we? Salad was local, blah, 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 blah. We'll go with the Frank. "Good evening, sir." Frank smiled at him, perfectly at ease in his unaccustomed role. "I'm doing the honors this evening. My discretion is impeccable. My service may not be, but I hope you'll forgive my slips." Corain nodded. Given his constituency, which compassed some of the abolitionist types, he might be uneasy about the unegalitarian situation that surrounded the dinner, but thoughts passed through his eyes, one of which was surely that he'd rather Frank do what he was doing and not have a leak of what they said here.
Yanni reckoned so, at least, and lifted his glass. Who'd have thought we'd sit at one well-stocked table? Here's to... what shall we call it, sir? Common sense, Corain shot back, quick on his mental feet, and glasses touched. They drank. Did Patil agree? Agreed and signed this afternoon, Yanni said, while Frank served the salad. She's on board. I've sent a message to Ollie Strassen at Fraggoth. I just finished a meeting with Sperlin, and he's on board. Busy day you've had, sir. Very. So, Corain said, how is Rezun faring these days, without the Nyes? A lot more decision-making on your desk? Or do we perhaps represent someone else? I haven't had that ever made clear, and I'd like to have, before the vote tomorrow. Not a stupid man, Corain, sensing, correctly, that his own position, though he'd been in on the planning, not something Defense knew, now came down to the one vote that could and would stop the Eversnow project. His having the critical vote held advantages very much worth exploiting, judiciously, getting full value for the transaction. What Corain surmised was unfortunately quite true. Rezun under the Nyes, while powerful, hadn't wielded the power it had under the first Ari. Rezun under the Nyes was perceived as yet another degree weakened. People believed, to a certain extent correctly, that the Schwartz administration was even more of a caretaker administration, but certain people saw that he was not averse to putting his own agenda forward, and hoped that it might represent a third force inside Rezun. It was a period in which concessions might be gotten, in which Rezun's power might be trimmed a bit, in which difficult agreements might be forced. Conditions the first Ari, or the Nyes, would never have agreed to, and Yanni Schwartz might, to get what he wanted. That was the notion Corain seemed to have about him. But he had held these sessions with Patil, Sperlin, and now Corain, in a chosen order and for a very good reason. He was a psych master, as the popular term was, out of Rezun, and sensible people in Corain's position, whatever their personal feelings, were open to a presentation of simple, career-affecting facts. He'd laid the foundation for this move. He'd gotten Corain interested before he went to Patil. He'd gotten Defense aboard, which Corain couldn't do, and flatly told Jacques to resign and throw his support to Sperlin or seek consequences to his reputation and his retirement income. Science was a key player, and Yanni played this one for all he was worth. This is your chance, Yanni said pleasantly, to get something. By the time my successor gets hold of the project, which will be some few years yet, things will be underway. You'll see the terraforming underway, and there'll be nothing much worth remediating at Eversnow. We've extracted microbes from the deep probes, not highly varied, at 4 widely separated sites. That's the total local life. We have the samples. So it's my estimation that young Emery won't try. She'll go with what's easiest, and she won't do a thing to stop it. Seems she already does things. Huge expenditures. New building at Rezun. The new labs upriver. My informants say they're both her projects. Keeps her busy, Yanni said. Pricey toys, sir. Useful in the long run. Rezun had a proven security problem. It won't hereafter. Security problem. The breath of a laugh. Then total sobriety. So you've just brought the first Ariane's murderer back to Rezun. That just baffles hell out of me. Oh, the man wanted to know about that. Shouldn't baffle you at all, Yanni said. He wasn't guilty. You admit it. Jordan didn't like Ari, but he wasn't guilty of murder. There was a small pause in Corain's demolition of the salad. The fork went down. And he agreed to detention, Yanni said, in his best interest. And you admit that? Corain said. Frank took the nearly empty salad plate, and Yanni's. Corain never looked down, just sat with a troubled look on his face. Why did he agree? Corain asked finally. He had no choice. It was an assignment. For us, expediency. The need to get Rezun going again.
It was paralyzed. The Nyes were trying to get contracts honored, agreements handled. He'd broken no laws. But he'd violated Regenesis policy.
Do you know who did kill Emery?
No, Yanni said. It's not actually important in modern context.
Context? I don't see it as a question of context. Maybe somebody should bring it up before the judiciary and ask about your context, sir.
Well, you and I can certainly do that and settle a question of history. Or we can proceed on a cooperative project that can benefit all of us.
I still find it troubling.
So far as I can do justice in the case, I've done it. Jordan Warrick is back at Regenesis. Not my doing, since we're being quite forthright here. Young Emery did it. The possible perpetrators are dead and out of reach, so, outside of correcting history, there's no point.
Correcting history has some value.
Actually, I agree. More than that, Jordan's a friend of mine, and I personally assure you we'll be engaged in that. Once we've gathered some records that someone attempted to bury, I simply signal you that there's more to the story, and I don't want to surprise you with any sudden revelations.
That would be a welcome change.
Among other things that may improve our working relationship, I want something to write down as an accomplishment for my own tenure, and righting that old wrong is one thing I intend to do. Improving relations with citizens is another. Part of that is carrying out this Eversnow business. It was one of Ari's last projects, and one she was willing to cede to terraforming. I agree with her, and I think you do. Although I don't think you'll be making it a major point for your constituency's consumption. We can't make Cyteen a laboratory. That's just out of the question nowadays. Too many complications, including the major city out that window.
Night had brought up the lights of Novgorod, other towers above the hard-roofed arcology that was the subway, the undergrounds, the deep digs, cofferdammed against Swigert Bay, and safe as a pioneering city could be in an atmosphere that could kill you if you got much above the 20th floor outside the bubble. The handful of skyscrapers were precip stations, pillars of the sky, guardians of human survival. Corrain's look was involuntary, and snapped back with a deep frown. We won't ever settle that argument, I'm afraid.
We may not. Say what you like for your voters. We're here, however, to talk about a safe laboratory that we can both agree on. Eversnow can prove whether or not terraforming can ever be done anywhere, and produce an ecology we can live in. And it will prove in the affirmative, I'm firmly convinced. I think there is a place for that science. The effort will teach us things for the benefit of my constituents. For yours, Eversnow will be that new Earth everybody dreams of.
Off in the far dark, Corrain said, at the end of the universe.
For now, you know the charts.
Expensive, god-awful expensive, at a time when your successor is busy spending your budget in advance. This is going to cost tax dollars, the whole remediation budget. How is my constituency going to benefit in the near term? I really want to hear it in words.
Immediate jobs at Fargon where the big construction will start.
No ASI there. None of this moving in your own personnel and calling it proprietary.
No ASI in construction except inside the labs. Building of the module, all open to bids. Then there'll be the station construction at Eversnow, give or take a decade. More jobs, right down to the first off-hours snack bar, shopkeeper and supplier that pioneers it out there.
Oh, that's... I just misread commas. No ASI there. None of this moving in your own personnel and calling it proprietary.
No ASI in construction except inside the labs. Building of the module, all open to bits. Then there'll be station construction at Eversnow, give or take a decade. More jobs, right down to the first off-hours snack bar, shopkeeper and supplier that pioneers it out there. Then more and more of them. Ultimately, a new trade route for Fargon. A military base outflanking any possible Alliance expansion. Sperlin is aboard. Science is. You are. Information is. Trade will be. There are no losers in this project. Not even the local microbes who are going to get an infusion of heat, light, and a chance to grow and adapt right along with our imports.
We're not going to wipe them out. We're going to use them, bootstrapping our way up. But that gets into technicalities. Huh. A grunt. The atmosphere had slowly eased. After a brief hiatus in the dinner, in which Frank hadn't moved, Frank deftly offered the choices of main course, pouring more wine. So, Corain said, and ate a few bites of chicken. This is good. Raziun Farms, Yanni said. No political objections, Corain said, and the mood lightened considerably. Until, after over coffee, Corain said, Patil's in vogue with the Paxers. That's going to create a stir when she takes a Raziun post. Paxers wasn't a word the head of the centrist party liked to use in public, but Corain used it here. And then he added, They're already fairly stirred up, not knowing what to think of you in charge of Raziun. They were caught off guard by Raziun's recall of Jordan Warrick. They'd been for that. They'll like the terraforming notion. They'll see certain of your recent actions as unraveling the Nye era, but certain of the leaders are going to be sitting up at night wondering what you're actually up to, and wondering what they ought to be up to, quite frankly. Are you unraveling the Nye era? Yes, Yanni said. In some ways, I am. Then why can't you admit publicly that Warrick wasn't guilty? I don't think he was. I think I've got a timeline that proves it. We're digging. But as I said, everyone who could have done it is dead now. Simple process of years. Process of the girl's security, you mean? Nobody came to Denys Nye's defense, Yanni said. Raziun Sect didn't, more to the point. Meaning you didn't stop her. Denys Nye's best effort couldn't stop her. He really didn't want to discuss his thought process during those hours, and he charitably didn't mention that he damned well knew Corain had been getting Jordan's version of affairs straight from Jordan Warrick, via a Planis tech with unspoken centrist affiliations. That wasn't the only leak at Planis. Defense had its own network, but he didn't bring that up. And you're his friend, Corain asked. Don't you want to see him exonerated? Jordan had opposed the first Ari, opposed her philosophically, bitterly, and politically. Jordan wasn't happy with the second one. I don't think, Yanni said considerately, that raising that question at this precise moment, with Eversnow at issue, can in any way benefit him or us. All it will do is stir up the Paxers at a time when we'd rather not have them stirred up, or gaining membership. Not to mention Roche and the abolitionists. Let me be completely honest with you. One strong theory I'm pursuing is that it was a directed killing by an Azzy. And that an Azzy can suddenly kill in civilian circumstances is not something we want bruited about. Bruited? I can't actually remember how that's pronounced. B-R-U-I-T-E-D, it's like bandied. Bruited about. Nor, I hope, do you, sir. You know, on an intellectual level, that it is possible. Of course, it's possible. Frank, you'd kill to protect me, wouldn't you? Absolutely, Frank said pleasantly. Corain looked unsettled. Downriver, Corain said, we tend to rely on civil institutions to protect us. Upriver, Yanni said, we occasionally find our isolation leaves us without other recourse. Not often. And Frank is a bodyguard. He doesn't advertise the fact, but he is. The point is, it's not going to happen without an expert intervention and some CIT's involvement. Whose? Corain asked. That's the question. If an Azzy did it, who directed it? Yanni hesitated over the answer, then said, Jordan is certainly one who could have done it. That's why it's not so simple to say he's guilty or innocent. Denys Nye could have done it. Possibly Jordan Nye. Or Ari herself. Corain's brows lifted. A variation on the suicide theory? She had cancer, sir. Nothing serious, except her rejuve was going. Probably the cancer was a symptom. It might have eventually caused her death, but that wasn't a sure thing. I'll tell you something about the first Ari, which I think you know very well. She liked to control the timing of events. And her death was a major, major event. for which it turned out she had amply prepared. So that's why you say that the perpetrator is likely beyond justice.
It's one theory.
But why in all reason did Jordan Warrick agree to take the hit? Yes, it was a transfer, but he could have appealed. Oh, that was disingenuous. Mikhail Corain hadn't spoken up for Jordan back then, hadn't spoken up loudly at all, and had politically hoped for Jordan's silence, since the immediate precursor to Ari's death had been Jordan's meeting with Corain and with defense. Jordan had been cutting a deal to trade Rezune's secrets and go public with charges, if Jordan could get himself and his son out of Rezune and under Defense Bureau and Citizens Bureau protection.
Who knows?
Yanni said, equally disingenuous. So is his return a controversial matter in Rezune? Interesting question. Clever way of putting it.
Not very. He's settling in. He doesn't yet have a practice. His son, you may know, runs an important office in Rezune. Young Emery is studying, mostly, not directly concerned with external affairs. You could say I want to deliver her a more peaceful universe. I want a universe in which she doesn't have to start out opposing you. A cooperative universe with less and less motive to destabilize what works. You know, that antiquated notion of progress by compromise? I think we've had enough of fringe groups and extremists. I know you don't like them any better than I do. I've tried to initiate compromise in my tenure. Personal legacy, sir. Personal legacy. That's my ambition.
Corain nodded quietly over his coffee. Whether Corain bought it all was a good question. Nobody trusted a psych master. Urban legend invented the word and amplified it into crazy notions of mind control and telepathy, all sorts of nonsense. The answer was, like most things, complicated. Yanni's reasons were complicated, and the manipulations were complicated. A little truth, aptly distributed, with very few outright lies. Divert and divide. Redirect the perception of profit involved. Create a little wedge. Defense interests and citizen interests. Those were easy to split. Defense was naturally expansionist. Citizens was naturally centrist. The Paxers' interests, however, weren't remotely divisible down that great divide of war years politics. Their name meant peace, but their war being over, nowadays they just wanted the power a large movement offered. Paxer rhetoric and Paxer violence could influence events. Violent acts could recruit the young and disaffected, while the old, canny, and astute Paxer leadership, some of whom were openly interviewed on the news these days, drew satisfaction from the fear that surrounded them. A clever old warhorse like Corain, head both of the centrist party and of the Citizens Bureau, the very constituency that happened to contain most of the Paxer movement, did know what grief his party would come to if the Paxers ever got their wish. This might be the time. Corain might well be persuaded to move the centrists closer and closer to the same interests as the expansionists, at least for this generation. Together, defense, information, science, and trade, the expansionists had a strong bloc in the Council of Nine. Add citizens to that, and they had an unbreakable majority on issues that citizens could remotely favor. And when the Nine swung that definitive await, the Council of Worlds historically fell into line. That wrapped it up neatly enough. Yanni sipped his coffee, reminisced a little with the first Ari's old adversary, and listened as much as he spoke. They didn't get into that second bottle of the Sauvignon. They weren't that friendly. And that is where we will call it for today. When I know what my schedule will be for next week, I will tell you all. Until then, we will be on for tomorrow. Same frag time, same frag station.
And all that jazz. Eat My Sparkles says, I feel like I shouldn't be laughing at this, but sorry, you're funny. Thank you. Yes, laugh at my suffering. It's not suffering, it's just going down the wrong tube. Let's see if I have any more cancellation requests, content strikes, anything, nothing, maybe. Let's hit refresh on that. No, nothing. I'm shocked. They just haven't figured me out yet. Oh, somebody yesterday was having trouble with the unchanging permanent link I had to the Discord server. When I tried to use it, it worked fine. I sent that person their name being SWA81. I sent them I think it's a 30-day link or a 24-hour link. I'm not actually sure. If anybody is having trouble with the no unauthorized reads this week, well, I mean, I'm pretty sure Regenesis is still in publication. So technically this isn't strictly legal. But whatever. But if there are any issues with the link, the Discord channel server link that I've included in the channel and stream descriptions, do please tell me so I can get that fixed. Anyway, why not? We'll do our usual and we'll double check to see if our boy, Peter Watts has anything up and running. I suspect he does not. Anything, no. Anything, no. Nope, nothing new. That's fine. I'm not crying. I just need more books by the mans. Anyway, thank you for tuning in, Derpy Shark. I can talk good, I promise. So yeah, tomorrow we will continue reading through this book, Regenesis. A lot of today's was all recap, kind of, and putting things in its context. We are starting to move some plot forward a bit, slowly but surely. Yikes, that went on kind of long. I did start a little later than I intended, but that's okay. Okay, we will tentatively move the barometer there. If that's part 1, that's part 2, that's about, the 6th of the book. It'll be another long one. Be at least, probably, I'm guessing, 10 installments or so. Anyway, until next time, I will see you all later. Thanks again for tuning in. Stay safe, stay sane, be decent to each other. Toodaloo!